Hello, we're here with Chris Nelson, extraordinary drummer, musician. He is going to talk about his life, his music, going to concerts. Thank you, Chris, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
First off, I want to ask you, how old were you and when did you first get into music?
So in terms of I've been like a music fan since I was like really young, when I was maybe 5 or so. My father was always really big into like classic rock, and something that I always kind of took on like a mild interest. I liked music, but I didn't. The first band that really made me like have a drive for it was when he showed me like the first the Appetite for Destruction record, which that gave me. I liked it so much. That's sort of what taught me how to like really enjoy music. In terms of actually playing it, I'm not sure really what the drive was. My brother, he would try to pick up instruments when he was younger, although he was always more of a sports guy. And I think at first the desire to try to learn an instrument came at first from my desire to replicate him. I tried to pick up a guitar like he did. I wasn't very good at it, neither was he. But the idea to play drums, I'm not entirely sure where it came from, but it just kind of came out naturally. I remember still wanted to try and learn an instrument, and I always had the tendency to like tap things, like just touch things, like tap them in patterns for one reason or another. And so it was like, maybe I could learn how to play drums. And my parents, they bought me like a Ludwig drum kit, like a full Ludwig 5-piece for Christmas when I was 10 or so. And right off the bat, I took to it right away. I was already a little bit natural at it. Not like, like, oh yeah, I'm so natural, I learned it right away. It's like, but I did have a natural tendency of keeping time with the drums when I started playing it. That part kind of came to me instinctively. And it wasn't until close to my teenage years I took drumming much more seriously as a passion. But I started playing around 10. It was around 13 or so I started like really wanting to get good at what I was doing.
Wow, that's incredible. What were your influences when you were growing up? Like what bands did you listen to? What were your big influences? And then now, what are your influences? So then and now.
There's some of the artists from when I was a young child, they blurred over. Some of my favorite bands when I was younger was, now they're not always for the same reasons. As a musician, when I was a child, one of my favorite drummers was Bill Ward from Black Sabbath, because I loved all of the fills that he would put in between each song and the sort of chaoticness to his drumming style. Neil Peart was another one, but of course he's Neil Peart. He needs no introduction, no explanation. Every drummer in the world will tell you that Neil Peart's one of their favorites. I also was a big fan of some other artists. Of course, I liked Guns N' Roses a lot. Steven Adler's drumming wasn't necessarily an influence to my own musicianship, but the type of sound and the sort of like swing that he has, like the bluesy looseness that Steven Adler has, was something that was part of it as well. Not so much because I'm not a very like a tight drummer. I'm more a bit looser, and I've always taken on to drummers that aren't so much like complicated, but I noticed I like drummers that have an emphasis on like a standard type of a musicianship, but also a lot of fills, a lot of like, and almost an animalistic style to drumming, like with a lot of chaos, but really clean at the same time. As I grew older, some of my other favorite drummers that really influenced me a lot with how I play, Trey Cool was a big one a lot. His chaotic drumming. What I would today call my personal favorite drummer would be Tim Alexander from Primus. Every time I play, even if I just want to just, joke around, just play on my kit for fun without trying any techniques or trying to play anything in particular, I always find myself trying to, without thinking about it, recreate his style with this sort of Tim Alexander, if you haven't, he's got like a very distinct flow to his drumming style. It's hard to put into words, but it feels like his drumming is just naturally, like he drums a certain style that no matter where you are in the song or the band, you can kind of gel with him. Like it's almost like a machine that just cranks out patterns, but he always has a very distinct style of fills and especially triplets. Tim loves his triplet fills. And so I always find myself implementing those in my own drumming, even if it may not fit, because I just think that they're so fun to play. And I also, on a more simpler side, the delicateness of, say, Bill Kreutzmann, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, Kreutzmann or Kreutzmann, from the Grateful Dead, is another drummer I took a lot of influence as well, especially during the era where he was the only drummer for the Grateful Dead in like the mid-'70s. I don't know exactly what it is, but he's got a cross between that bluesy feel and this light delicateness when he drums at the same time, which I also really like a lot. But of all the drummers, I would still stick to Tim Erb as probably being my favorite drummer, maybe of all time.
Okay. Wow, that's incredible. So when you were growing up, did you have musical mentors or mentors otherwise that influenced you in your life?
Not really. For the most part, I was pretty self-taught and just kind of played what it is that I felt like playing. I didn't learn how to read music until I took lessons from you. I was able to like hear a song and replicate the drum pattern by ear, which for most songs that are rock and roll, if you know how to play, isn't super hard to do, to implement them by ear. The more complex ones are a little difficult, but I never really had a lot of tutoring or mentoring. Most of my drumming skills were self-taught before I took lessons from you.
Okay. Any other people that influenced you as far as business, life, like anybody else in your life that was a big impact on you growing up?
Well, that is an interesting one. Of course, my father was always a big drive in trying to pursue my musicianship, but he thought he knew more than he did, but he was a very intelligent man and more so one about the encouragement. I also had my uncle. My uncle, his name is Brian. He was a drummer as well. Him and my father would try to get me like some better quality equipment, especially in my later years as an adult, but as a child as a lot too. They helped me get the Ludwig kit. They would help me like Brian in particular, because he would try and teach me a little bit about some of the standard mechanisms. Like he taught me about how to tune my drum kit and some other important factors like that, like how to like tonality between testing out different heads, or more notably what he emphasized, different cymbals, and how different cymbals in one drum kit can sound drastically different if you don't make sure that their tones match up a lot, which is now I usually buy one particular type of crash, or actually I don't even buy crashes anymore. I just mostly buy rides and use those as crashes. But he taught me a lot about how to make sure you're not just your drums are in tune, but the tone between when you're buying equipment, because drums can be bought like piecemeal, one part at a time, and what to look for to make sure when you're buying parts and not sets, how to make sure those parts are in tune with what you already have.
Wow, that's definitely like a big influence. Somebody's giving you equipment and or trying to teach you about tuning and proper almost like decisions on what to get for your style. So yeah, that's pretty incredible. When you were in school, I guess you'd be elementary, middle, and high school. Were you participating in music programs, symphonic band, concert band, jazz band, rock band, a marching band, pit orchestra? Did you do any activities in school?
I did try to join like their like the school choir band. Not choir. I forgot what the type of band it was, but they had a drumming position available for like the school band when I was in elementary school. I wasn't able to audition in time before the deadline, but once I actually saw them perform, I was like, I'm not sure that would be more my style, because it's more of like a formal like percussion role as opposed to regular drumming behind a kit, which I wasn't as familiar with. So I'm not so much in elementary school. When I got to middle school, the principal there, I believe his name was Mr. Whitney. I forgot his name, but he was a really cool guy, and he himself was a professional musician. He actually had like done some touring spots, and apparently he was friends with Eddie Money. Everyone in Pleasanton is friends with someone who's way too rich for their own good. But he had a rock and roll club where him and two other teachers would get a whole bunch of people together, and they would play like classic rock, and we had songs like Nothing Too Complicated. We would do covers of Paranoid and Crazy Train and Running Down the Drain and a few other covers here and there. But it was all like classic rock, which was really cool that we got to do something like that. Although the thing is that when you have a bunch of middle schoolers, and there was like 30 of us, so it'd be 30 people in one rock band. And when you have 30 people, as you can imagine, you have one drummer, one bass player, 28 guitar players. So the sound would be a little bit ridiculous when you have all these extra guitars. But having a rock and roll band like that was really cool. introduced me to other musicians in the same group, people who actually I didn't know at the time, but I would meet later on that would become really good friends. But I met some people that I was able to start other bands with. And even though those projects never went anywhere, it got me into the mentality of how important it is to play with other people. And sort of like how you go about trying to meet musicians and try to start work with them. The rock and roll club I had in middle school was the first taste I had of trying to start a band with somebody, and kind of made me want to try and start bands with other people too. But what I've also learned is that it takes a lot of people that you go through before you really find a musician that gels with you, that you can kind of play with, that you have like the same mentality of what you want to sound like, and that you guys have enough chemistry with each other. I haven't really found a musician that I really felt that I had like a bit of chemistry with until I was in my 20s. But it was the process in middle school in that rock and roll club that taught me the first groundwork of starting a band with somebody else and what you should be looking for when you start that band with somebody else. High school was a whole different ballpark, because high school I started getting distracted by more more experimental things, if you know what I mean.
So you didn't participate at that point?
Of course, I still played and still started bands with other people, but like school projects with musicians, school bands, including like rock bands. I found out by the time I was a senior, there was like a rock band with the school, but it was more like a de facto rock band. Like, it wasn't like middle school where they had a club for it. This was more like something, we just so happened to have like these musicians that were really good at rock music, and they decided to have like a colloquial band for them. Like, if it was a themed day, they would play a show. Like, if it was a pep rally, they play a small rock show with the school's marching band. It was a 60 day, they did all like these 60s rock covers and 80s rock covers for 80s day. But that wasn't sponsored by the school the same way the middle school was. So I'm not sure if they had any projects comparable to the ones I liked in middle school at high school. They did have some projects I could have pursued, but I chose not to because I'm in high school. High schoolers are the most apathetic group of people that there is. They don't have any motivation to try and improve themselves. They're mostly concerned about who has a car, who has drugs, and who you maybe like to sleep with in the future. Good. And my mind went over there and away from musicianship, even though drumming was still very important. It was almost a necessity. I actually broke up with the girl that I was dating because she wanted to see me so much at the time. I didn't have any chance to play my drums anymore because she would either always come over or want me to see over there. And because I couldn't play drums, I started losing my mind. It was around high school I realized that I'm almost addicted to it. If I go too long without playing the drums, I get like tension builds up inside me. Like, I start to get stressed. I start to get more angry. It's almost like a therapeutic for me to keep playing. It's almost a necessity at this point.
Wow, that's a really good point. Something I've lived with my whole life, where I've always practiced. I'm a practaholic. I love practicing and playing. The only time I took a week off is when my mother passed away. And I actually had gigs. I had a gig that night, in fact, and my girlfriend at the time wouldn't let me do the gig. She's like, "No, you're not doing the gig," because I was going to do the gig. Because I got to do the gig, right? That's how I'm trained. It's like, got to do the gig, so that's my job. And she's like, "You're not doing the gig," and then at that point, I took a week off, and that was the only time. Otherwise, I don't do that, So I totally get what you're talking about. And then people pulling you away from that, yeah, I get that too. That's like not, it's almost like kind of not understanding the life of a musician, and how important that is.
Absolutely.
But there's a balance, which is another thing I'm learning. I'm not good at it, I'll be honest with you, but I'm learning.
Passionate musicians don't know balance.
Yeah. The Karate Kid is a good thing, like balance, so having the balance in your life. But that's you make a good point about, like, having the drive and the therapy and how it makes you feel, like you feel a sense of accomplishment and it really is really good for your self-esteem and everything, especially when you get better, when you see
absolutely
improving. Yeah. So next question. Did you take private lessons early on? And if so, when did you start taking private lessons?
I started taking private lessons with you. So I actually had I'm not like well-rounded, but I had a little bit of like a decent amount of talent and some musicianship and a bit of knowledge of being behind the drum kit before I took any lessons. So you already knew that I knew a little bit about playing before I met you, but it's also weird because you didn't know the basics, because I can get behind a kit and play because I was able to get behind a kit and play a cover of like a song that may not be like, difficult, but not easy to play either, almost note for note. Like I could probably have played a song that I would have discovered a lot too, like say, I don't want to like say anything that'll be like sound like falsely impressive that wasn't true. I don't want to overhype my own abilities, but I could play certain covers pretty good, but I had no idea what a paradiddle was. And so the first private lessons I had were from you, and I did not take any private lessons before or since then, actually.
Wow. Amazing. So you basically had natural talent and you could figure things out. You had a good ear, which is actually a really good thing to have for a musician, is to have that ear where you can hear things and figure things out. And yeah, there are some people that never take lessons that kind of figure it out that way, and they call it self-taught. So, that is one aspect of music, and always the biggest aspect is always your ear. So you make a good point about that, and I'm honored that I was the only teacher. I didn't know that. So then when you were playing drums, did you have a practice routine, and were you practicing every day, or did you have did you have a certain thing you would do when you're practicing? Did you practice your lesson, or did you try to learn songs, or were you trying to learn different beats? What was your practice routine, and how much did you practice growing up?
Still to this day, I practice at around the same rate, about every couple of days. If I have like enough energy or like enough time to practice every day, I will if I can. But more realistically, every few days, try to play at least a few times a week, and then again on the weekends. And again, my practice methodology is about the same, but probably even more disciplined. I did try and practice the lessons that you would give me, but of course, when getting lessons, I never would take that seriously enough at the time. It's always later on, like in the midst of like getting something that you would tell me, like, I want you to go home and practice this. And at the time, you're like, okay, left, right, left, right, like yada. Of course, I'm like blah 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 blah. It's not until later on, as you become more polished as a musician, that you realize how important those techniques become. But in general, while I would try to practice those techniques 99% of the time, it's still to this day, I try to be more disciplined today to practice techniques and to practice playing styles of music and genres of music that I haven't played before. I still find myself almost never playing with a metronome, but trying more and more to do so nowadays. I had very little discipline as when I was younger, and mostly I would try to play songs and learn how to play new songs, as many different songs as I could figure out. But the techniques I would try to play with, but I find myself more and more focusing on technique as an adult, knowing how much more significant they are, because when you're younger and you think you're already on top of the world as an arrogant teenager, it's easy to get standard roles or standard rudimentary lessons and think, I don't need this over here. I'm just going to play the same NoFX song 20 times in a row. That's all I need to know. That you don't realize until you get older. But the good news, if you still practice that, that'll still come into play later on. You may not know when taking lessons what's going to come into play later on, but once it does, that's when it will hit you.
Wow, good point. I want to shift over to like some of the music programs you did. So you were talking about the I guess you'd call it the camp or workshop you did with John Mater.
Oh yeah, the music camp rocks.
Yeah,
I think that's what they called it.
You did different things, right? You were playing in different kinds of camps, or I don't know what you want to call it. I call it workshops, but things outside.
It kind of is a workshop, because calling it a camp implies that you're like staying there and like that you would be living somewhere else. But it's more of a workshop because you would just come into like a practice room for a couple hours a day, and you would write a few songs. And so that was like a 6-week program. you and whatever other kids were around, we would pick like 4 or 5 different cover songs you'd want to do, and then you would write at least one original song, and then you would play all that live at a little pub, which was technically, with the exception of the shows I did for school, that would have been the first live show I've done that wasn't for the middle school. And so you would come in, but the thing is that because you are put in by classes based on when you sign up and who you're paired up with, you can get kind of a mishmash of different musicianship. We didn't have any guitar players. Every other band had a guitar player except ourselves. We had to use a keyboard or a drum machine to make up the guitar sounds, like to compensate for that. So we would learn a cover, and we would put the guitar, we would have to compromise to songs that we could play on a keyboard or play on a drum machine to make up for that. So the songs that we had were much more straightforward guitar patterns. I remember wanting to do a Guns N' Roses cover, but we couldn't think of any Guns N' Roses songs that were easy enough to play on a drum machine or a keyboard. So we had this one other kid that was really, he was younger than me, but he was really hell-bent on doing no effects. I didn't like no effects so much at the time. Now I love them. But he was really hell-bent on doing a no effects cover. But not a single other person had even heard of no effects. We didn't have a single idea like how to do a no effects song. But knowing that he liked punk rock, I was like, hey, I know a song that's pretty easy to learn. There's a song called Self-Esteem by the Offspring. It's pretty much just it's basically just the same type of strumming pattern and different chords. So we could probably put that on a drum machine. And that was the type of compromises we would make. We also learned Paranoid and Eye of the Tiger, and Seven Nation Army, as opposed to other songs we wanted to learn for the fact that we were compromised. It was a really good service because if there's one thing that's really underrated that you don't get a lot of experience of when you're playing by yourself, even with a metronome, is how mistakes can affect your performance. If I'm playing by myself, even with a metronome or knob, if I make a mistake, it's just my own mistake. But when you're playing with other people, you are forcing yourself to have to play better because of how your mistakes can affect the other musicians, especially if you're the drummer and your mistake involves around keeping time. If you're a guitar player and you slip out of time, you could probably slip back in by keeping an eye on the drum beat. But as a drummer, it requires much more discipline because your mistakes will affect the rest of the band more so than a guitar player or a bass player will affect everyone else. So as a drummer, it's really almost underrated the fact, even though the band didn't have any guitar players, we had to compromise what we would learn, what we would play, and had to make all these setbacks. It's still very critical, these types of workshops as a drummer, so that way you can be as polished as you need to be, because your mistakes will affect the rest of the artists or the rest of the musicians, the rest of the band, more so than their mistakes will affect you.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was going to tell you that I interviewed my mentor, my teacher, who he played in Journey, and then he left and he went back. And one of his points was that young musicians are not playing together, and they're playing with what's called tracks. So they play with a pre-recorded track and they put it on YouTube and show off their playing. But his point is that, you know, if you're not playing with real people, human beings, and how everything affects each other, then, you know, you don't really know what it's like to have that human interaction. And if something affects somebody else, how it can either train wreck or it could, you know, snowball into this great thing. So that was one thing that I think, you know, really stuck, is that when I was a kid, I played the records, and then when I started playing with people, I thought it was really good, and then when I started playing with people, I realized how bad I was. Like, I couldn't keep time. I couldn't, you know, I didn't know how to, keep the band together or make everything stick, you know. So that took me years just to be able to play with people, right? And it's something that, you know, you talk about a few things. You talk about chemistry. You talk about, you know, your responsibility. You're talking about keeping time. You're talking about, you know, playing precisely so you don't make mistakes, and how that affects other people. If you make a big mistake in a drum fill or something, the whole band can fall apart, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's literally chaos. It could be a train wreck. It could be like a train derailment, you know, and everybody gets killed, you know, that kind of thing. it can ruin a performance. So there is a big responsibility to it, and you won't get that unless you play with people. You won't ever realize that, because if you're, just like you said with a guitar player, if you're playing with a recording, you can make a mistake, but the track is never it's gonna keep going.
The track's gonna be perfect. The track's never gonna mess up.
Right. So you can kind of recover from that. So yeah, that's a really good point. People will learn a lot from that. So
and also, I want to follow up with that really quick. What you mentioned, that you're a drum teacher for the Drummer for Journey, said. I also think that you'll notice a lot of musicians on YouTube, like on the internet, that are like solo musicians. They'll use drum tracks, and a lot of them I really like a lot. Like there's one, they go by their aliases. Like there's one musician I like a lot. He takes all these covers and he makes them like ska covers. It's called the Ska Tune Network. Really good. But all of his drum tracks, like he plays everything. He plays guitar, he plays bass, he does the horns, he does the vocals, all by himself, but not the drum track. And I noticed that more and more of these musicians, when they're publishing their work over the internet or on Spotify or their streaming services, they're using drum tracks or drumming programs to replicate those sounds. And while maybe that sounds good on the record or on the album, but some of them will still take that live. And you cannot replicate a drummer with a machine, especially live. There is no substitute for the impact, especially for live music, that an actual drummer you can't substitute for it. The feeling in your chest when there's a loud kick and the snare, it cannot be recreated. And I actually think that even for recording platforms, I take a bit of a personal issue the more and more we use drum machines and drum tracks and not actual drummers. Drummers are already an endangered species. Every rock band that wants a drummer, they have to get a drummer that's playing in 2 other bands. And yeah, the last thing we need is to lose more of them to drum machines and drum tracks.
When I grew up, probably when I was out of college, drum machines were being invented, and they were programming it. So programming took a long time, but they were starting to do that. So a lot of guys were doing, there were session musicians that would do 1 million recording sessions on 1 million different recording projects and albums and #1 hits and all that. Started getting replaced by drum machines. So that was happening, and then you know what happened?
What's that?
That died. So the drum machines, they started going, you know what? We want a real drummer. Even though they tried to make drum machines real, like this real feel, like it's a little bit, loose, and we can make the time, we can shift the time a little bit and make it more human sounding. Then they go, nope, we want a real drummer. So certain things like like certain kinds of music was being programmed. Then they had stuff where drummers would play over like a loop or something like that. And then it was like certain music, you could not have a drum machine. It would not work. You had to have a real drummer. And that's kind of where it went. So it went back. So it's funny how it kind of, like you're talking about that now, but that kind of happened in music. It went one direction, it was going there, and then this is always going to be perfect, it's going to save us time, but they realized that, no, it takes time to program. You actually have to program a machine, a computer. That takes time, just like somebody actually doing a track, and then guys that were real good could probably learn the song and play like 1 or 2 takes and they're done. And that was before people like doing the editing and all that. They could actually play on like tape. They could do it like 1 or 2 times perfectly and save a bunch of time. So that's kind of the how things evolved. They went there and then it went back. So that's a good point that you made. Can you talk about some of the bands that you performed with outside of your, I'd say, workshops? Did you form bands and different things, and that you had played with, and you played gigs, or venues, or recordings?
So most of the bands that I started with, they ended up not really going anywhere. So I started, like the first band I ever started, the majority of them were just ended as us as a band, and then realizing we weren't getting along with each other for one reason. I knew this kid in middle school as the first band. We weren't really able. He had original songs. We actually had one original song that was written by his father, and the recording of it, I think, is still on YouTube to this day. It's a little song called "Ambulance Child," but that never went anywhere outside of being recorded in that guy's house. I had that band with Chandler Jones, who I suspect didn't like playing with me very much for reasons that were more because, well, he was a whole level of musicianship above me at the time. If anything, I was probably dragging him down because he was a 10 times better musician and songwriter than I was as a drummer at the time. The only thing I was better than him at was actually drumming because he could play drums too. But I never really had a lot of projects that got off the ground. I did start a few more other bands, but again, either I wasn't too good for them, they were too good for me. A lot of times it was hard to find someone playing music I want to play. Most of the guitar players that want to start bands, I noticed, would ask me about very old school style sounds. Like they wanted to recreate an AC/DC type of rock and roll sound, but I wanted to do something a little more modern or a little more original. The first group I had, we didn't have a name, but we did play a few shows. And the closest thing I had to a permanent lineup is where there were these two kids. One of them was like a high school senior. The other one was in college. I was like in this was very recently, actually. This was right before I moved to Austin, so this was only about a year ago. And these two kids that we were playing with, they were both really good, but the guitar player, the younger one in high school, he was the first player that I felt like that we had a sort of like chemistry, like we kind of wanted the same thing and we kind of gelled off each other really well. And the thing is that he was a great guitar player, but he'd only been playing for a tiny amount of time. He'd been playing for only 2 years, but his musicianship was way higher than other 2 years. And he had some other tendencies that were like, man, this guy's a borderline super genius. Like, on a side note, he could take a Rubik's Cube and solve it in like 30 seconds. If you blindfolded him and just, here you go, and like take it off and go, there you go, solved. So he was almost like a borderline super genius. I would mention in passing, like we would be in the early days and like talking about bands that we like. He was still new to music, even though he was so good at it. He could only maybe name off a half dozen or a dozen artists he listened to, all AAA like Metallica and Guns N' Roses and Green Day. And I was like sort of indoctrinating him into a bunch of new music, but he was so good at the musicianship that I would mention like, oh, hey, here's a cool band that you should check out. Like, hey, check out this band. They're called, this band's called, I don't know, just an example. This band's called Audio Slave. You should give them a check. They're really good. Check out these guys. They're called Pearl Jam. These guys are called the Dead Kennedys. Give them a listen. And then I would show him these bands. And the next day he was like, hey, you know that band you showed me? I learned the song by them. And he would play the entire song like to an atom perfectly after only being gone for a week. So, and he always would crank out his own riffs. He had cranked up stockpiles of songs that were actually really good. And we had developed our own chemistry of like, you know, when you play with another musician for a long enough amount of time, you can kind of communicate telepathically. That you can kind of feel like, okay, we're going for this type of energy at this point now. Okay, we're going to do this type of change. You kind of can look at each other and go like, okay, we're coming for the big change on 3, 2, 1. The bass player, not as much between me and the guitar player. He didn't have the same drive, but he had that connection with him. And the guitar player had that connection with me. And we did play we played a few shows together. It was the first time we were ever paid to play live. Nothing professional, but we did have played a number of different parties, like especially for the families. And we've had a few freelance gigs for his church. And we also were big fans of Green Day. So in addition to our original project, we also had a Green Day cover band that was just the three of us as well. So we basically did two things at the same time. One that was our own act, and one that was also a tribute to Green Day. The Green Day one got us more shows because maybe we were like, oh, hey, you're doing Green Day cover. That's kind of cool. But the original songs were like something that I felt that were really going somewhere. And that was the lineup those songs that we got paid to perform for a couple of the shows. And it was, but we never had an official name. We never formalized or recorded anything, but it was the project that we had the most groundwork. And I felt like that if it wasn't time for me to move out of the state, maybe I could have taken that somewhere. And that's probably the only thing that I regret at this point of moving out of California, that I had a project, a band, that I really felt like could go somewhere. Maybe not somewhere like be famous or anything, but that I was happy with who I was playing with. I got along with who I was playing with. We were all good friends with each other. We all liked a lot of the same music. We had they were all really good musicians. We all wrote good songs. We all had a chemistry with each other. And unfortunately, it just wasn't meant to be. But the most recent project I had is the best one I've been in. And I'm hoping that once the quarantine ends and the coronavirus dies down, I can maybe try to replicate that. But now learning a lot about being in a band from them, I've learned a lot more of what it is that I want to sound like. What type of sound? If I want to start a band, what do I want to sound like myself as a musician and the music that we're playing together? I'd always find myself not wanting to lose a new musician, realizing that we wouldn't get along with the type of music that we like until we realized after we've been playing for months that we weren't going anywhere. So I finally met with some musicians that we had like the same vision in mind. And it kind of helped me realize, okay, now I know what it is I want to do. I know what it is I want to sound like. I know what it is, what kind of music I want to be looking for. And now I'm a little more like a bit of a backbone of what musicianships I want to look for. And there was one other project that around the same time, there was a heavy metal band. This one was actually kind of formalized because they already had an album called Forged from Fire. I played a replacement show for them, and they wanted me to become their permanent drummer as well. And I at first was all on board to have both projects at the same time, the Passion Project with the two high schoolers and this metal project. I actually have a video online of us doing a cover of Killing in the Name at a Halloween show at this bar down in Crockett. And they wanted me to be the permanent drummer for their first full album. But I eventually decided not to do it because I knew who the producer was. The person who was producing the album and managing the band, I knew them personally. I did not like them. I did not trust them. And I felt that there was going to be some shady stuff going on behind the scenes. So in a very rude way, what I regret the most was not that I quit, but how I quit by basically ghosting them, which I do regret a lot. And eventually I met up with them later and apologized for that. But my decision to not play with the band, while I do kind of wish that I did because of the same type of thing. Well, musically, we didn't get along the same way I did with the other two younger kids, but I got along with them very well as people, and our chemistry was there. But it turns out I was right about the people working behind the scenes, that they were very shady. There was a lot of promises that were made and not kept.
No, that's a good point. Did you have, with any of these bands, did you have a performance or recording that stuck out to you as like the aha moment, the great performance? You felt good about yourself. You felt the gel happen between the band and the audience, and you just had that moment where you just were on top of the world. Like this was like why I'm playing. This is the reason why I do music, and this situation that happened that made it all worth playing and made it all worth performing. Did you have any of those? Can you recall any of those kind of moments?
That's a good question. Let's see. To a moment that passion, I think that I've only been able to play a very small amount of shows. I could probably count out each live show I've ever played, like on a very formatable list. Probably less than 20 total, maybe only a dozen or so. So those sort of high moments are a little fewer and far between. Sometimes you may notice it in hindsight because like when I was playing in the metal show, in hindsight, when you look back at the show, it was a really good performance, but at the time, because I wasn't as familiar with the music, so in the back of my mind, I constantly think of myself, like, I need to make sure I nail this back of my head. Like, I would find myself being more distracted by what I could mess up, more so than by being happy with what I was doing right. But that metal show I did on Halloween is something that I realized was so good in hindsight because the audience reaction to our band was much more positive than the bands that followed up. We were the opener, the very first show, and we weren't even supposed to be on the gig. One of the people that we knew who knew the owner, they're like basically like, please let them just open up, just 25 minutes, not even 20 minutes, beginning of the show, like 4 or 5 songs, that's it. Really beginning just some quick, nothing major. It sounds like Avenged Sevenfold. It's like, okay, fine, okay, 20 minutes, that's it. And the reaction from the show and the audience was actually better than the bands that were actually headlining. And so I don't mean like, yeah, I gotcha, but it was like, wow, in hindsight, we had a pretty good show. I also played a show for my brother's birthday with the two Latino kids. And that was more of a fun thing, but that was probably the most fun show that we've had because of all of our families were there. But the show that I think that we performed the best altogether, the very last show we did with the two younger kids, the very last show I did with them was for a small party that one of their friends was hosting somewhere in the South Bay. I forgot what city it was in. I think it was in I think it was in San Rafael or something like that. It was on the other side of the Dumbarton. And that was the show that when we were playing together, it was felt like it was like slicing butter. It just came. We grooved so naturally, and we already played together pretty well. But that was like the very first time that we were all playing together, and we felt like that we were all in our own bubble and each other at the same time. We didn't have to think about like, okay, you're ready for this change up. It was the first time that it just gelled naturally, and it felt like lightning struck of how well we performed with ourselves and as a band. And so that was the thing that was disappointing, that lineup wasn't able to stay because I had to leave. And I do kind of regret that, because that was the first time that was like, we finally have established the perfect chemistry, that sort of psychological connection that a group of musicians in a band need to have with each other. I've never had the all-around encompassing moment at one show. I don't think I've had enough experience either in groups or playing live to truly get that special moment. But that last show, the last live show I've ever played, was the closest I've ever come. And I feel like that if I could find another group of musicians I can play with well again, there'll be many more of those days to come once concerts are legal again.
Well, and I would probably say that you've played a lot compared to a lot of people who haven't really played or experienced playing out at all. So that's a really incredible experience that you actually started to get there, right? And you kind of found the right people, the right chemistry, the right venue, that it was starting to happen. So that's actually really positive. So I'm going towards the last couple questions here. So when you did study with me, how did you benefit from my curriculum, and what specific areas do you think helped you the most?
It was all about stick technique. The very first thing that probably impacted me the most right away is like the actual technique of trying to perform roles, how you're specifying different types of grip. Like, okay, so you have like French grip, you have like American grip, and these different variables of how the technique of how you use the sticks. Because I remember it was those warm-up rolls in the beginning. You would start off with very standard doubles or something, or paradiddles. Remember towards the end of the lessons, some of those rolls were getting really complicated. I'm like, are you sure this is the warm-up, or are we trying to do the drum intro for like, is this Tom Sawyer or something? But it was about the stick technique of how to keep those rolls steady while also giving the durability on your fingers. Like, because your wrists will get torn out, your fingers will get worn up, your fingers are going, but not even that it hurts, but you just don't have that control. And the ability to grind out those rolls and get like the muscle strength you need is something that was very important that I noticed right away. Although, because I was not, the unfortunate truth is that I should have been taking your lessons more seriously than I was at the time. Not that I wasn't taking them seriously, but maybe I needed a little bit more discipline. And a lot of what you taught me came more apparent as I kind of polished myself out to become a much cleaner and more profound drummer to myself, and to where there's a lot of techniques you taught me then that I wasn't really able to implement the way I know that I really needed to until I got older. The one that I think was probably the most important to opening up a doorway, that one technique that you taught me towards the end of our reign, of how important it was, that really opened up the door for different ways of me playing and being like, excuse me, I'm talking here. So, by the way, I have a dog now.
I see that.
His name is Taz, and he is a terrier mix between Jack Russell and a few other terrier breeds. He's super cute, but he's very smart and very nosy. He's upset that I haven't scritched him for about... He's been sitting right next to me this whole time, and I've been scratching him off camera. And I stopped for 5 minutes, and I guess now his attention span worn out. But the technique that is most substantial was how to implement ghost notes. And I didn't realize just how commonplace in music and drumming that ghost notes really are. Some of the most standard rock songs, the ghost notes are everywhere. And that it made drumming feel so much more fluent and natural, especially if you're playing like standard 4/4 beat, can make it feel like something so much more intricate and so much more like fluent with ghost notes in there. And to the extent that I can sort of kind of halfway competently, choppingly play Fool in the Rain.
Cool. That's a hard tune.
That is a very hard tune, but if all of a lot of techniques, and again, they all kind of come in subconsciously. You might forget the technique. You may not be thinking paradiddles all the time in your head, but once you're playing once you're behind the kit, and the important thing is that you learn the techniques physically, but then you let your instincts take over. And like I mentioned earlier, you might be saying, oh yeah, double rolls, I don't need to really know how to do left, left, right, right. But then once you actually play a song that you want to play with that type of technique, it's like that is important to have that type of practicing there. Even some of the most standard rock and roll songs have these subtleties and these important techniques in terms of their rolls and their timing and all these other variables that come in that you don't hear. But when you try to play the song by ear, and if you don't know that those things are there, you don't know how to play doubles, you don't know how to use ghost notes, it just won't sound the same until you find out how to properly implement that into your technique. So at the time, it almost felt like, I'm not even sure why I'm taking these lessons, but later on, it's like, I am so glad that that technique was taught to me then, because I would have found myself going all the way back with a lot more difficulty if I didn't get to practice those measurements at the time. So, and that goes like anyone else who's watching this interview, any kids that may not be certain about wanting to take lessons, you might find yourself being taught a lot of things that may not seem important at the time, a lot of techniques that seem like they're just busy work, they're just grinding, they're not fun to play, kind of like how you're playing guitar for the first time and you're focusing more on major or minors rather than playing songs, and you're probably going to find yourself with your drum teacher teaching you a lot of things you don't want to bother practicing, a lot of things you don't want to bother knowing, things that you might think, why do I need to know this? I could play the best drum fills ever. Why do I need to know what a paradiddle is? But if you don't learn it at square one, it's going to be way harder when you do need to play it. And maybe you might find yourself not needing to know like the terminologies, but the techniques are what's important. It doesn't matter if you don't know what a paradiddle is. It matters if you know how to play it and how to implement that in different types of styles of drumming. The lessons may not come to a parent right away, but further down the road, the more you play, the more you realize how many things that your teachers taught you, you didn't realize you were learning or you didn't realize you would know how to use. It may take a couple weeks, may take a couple years, may take a decade, but they will come into play. And the worst thing you could do is ignore those types of fundamentals, especially if it's a very basic fundamental. Maybe you were already self-taught. I was already self-taught a little bit before I had drum lessons, and almost thought some of the things at first were like, I already know this. But you don't know this, and it won't come into play later until you're trying to play something you want to play after you polished your musicianship. You're like, now I know what he's talking about. Now I know why we need to know these things.
Well, that's really great advice, and I think it's going to help a lot of people. You know, because you kind of lived it, so you saw like the before and the after.
Absolutely.
So last question for you. What are your goals for the future, musically or otherwise?
My goals for the future in general, I don't have so much objective goals. My number one goal in life is that you only get one life, you only get one chance, and you want to try and spend as much time of it doing things you enjoy as possible. Now, many kids don't go out there trying to make an excuse like, I'm not going to go do my homework, I want to play Fortnite and Call of Duty because I want to spend as much time doing fun things as possible. Happiness is a chemical reward for doing work. And especially as you grow older, you'll notice that the more time you spend having fun, the less you appreciate it, because there's going to be something around the time you're around my age that's going to tell you, hey, you have responsibilities too. So, but I still do think that it's the most important to enjoy as many things as you're doing as often as you can in the one life that you get. So in terms of my goals in life, my ultimate goal is really just to spend as much of the time enjoying it and as less time as possible not enjoying it. And musicianship plays a part of that. My number one goal in terms of musicianship is as much so to have a specific career. Like, I'm not necessarily looking to start a band to become famous, but more so to start a project that I can be happy with. To play music even on the side would be fine with me. It's more so that I'd be happy with what I'm doing with my musicianship, more so than what I'm trying to achieve with it. It's more about being happy with what you're doing than having a goal to work forward to. It's great to have a goal to work forward to, and that can sometimes put the drive to get to that happiness, but don't assume that the goal equals happiness. The journey is sometimes half the fun. Maybe you want to get in the studio and make an album, but you might have more fun making the album than what might come from the aftermath. Although I would consider that my biggest goal at this point is to try to start a band and have a full 12-track LP is my number one goal to achieve at this time, because I'm so close to achieving it, because I know how it's done, I know it needs to be done, and I know that I'm talented enough to find a band, write songs, and record an album, which would be my number one goal in terms of an objective. But overall, my number one goal is to enjoy playing drums more so than forcing it to be too much of a chore. Drumming is work, and work is what makes it happy, but too much work can ruin the experience too. So my ultimate goal is to enjoy what I'm doing, and playing live can be really fun, and that's another important too, is to enjoy playing with your musicians that you're playing with, enjoy playing with your friends, enjoy playing in the studio, and enjoy playing live. Not so much to have a goal with it, but to enjoy it is my goal. Some people need a goal to have the enjoyment. Some people just kind of can go with the flow. I'm sort of like floating in the middle, but as long as I'm happy when I'm playing, that's really all I need.
Awesome. Well, Chris, it's great. I found you after all this time, and I actually called your number and you answered, because I did try to reach you, and I've been trying to reach, is my journey and my goal here. I'm trying to reach out to people that I've been teaching, and I've been teaching for over 35 years, and catching up with people is not easy. That part of it's really hard.
It is not.
Finding out that I cannot get in touch with people, or there's no way to get in touch with them, or people that are not willing to do this, which they, like you talked about with your metal band, sometimes they don't do it in a great way that I can't find out, like they would rather not do it, but the people that have done it, it's been really awesome, and I think it's really been, for me, it's been very joyful, because I can see that I've touched people's lives and they've touched my life, and it's something that I think is really going to be memorable, and I want to use these interviews for my teaching course that people are going to get something out of that will help them with their journey in music. So I thank you so much for doing this.
Absolutely, Rob. And I'm glad you reached out to me too, because I'm not going to, there's been a number of times that I've always wanted to I should really reach out to X person. There's a whole bunch of people my old friend from high school, my video game buddy from middle school, and you're one of the people I'm I should probably reach back out to them, but I don't have their number anymore. And he's even trying to tell my dad, well, doesn't he have a website? I'm well, I think he does. Maybe I could try that. And he's and I wanted to say, I would just hope that Rob Hart would at least know that those lessons weren't for nothing, because I'm sure tons of teachers see all types of musicians that come in, play for weeks, months, maybe even years, but that eventually just toss it to the side. And I would just always want it, and I think to myself a lot, I hope Rob would one day find out that I'm still playing, and that his lessons helped me a lot, more than I knew they would at the time, more than I knew they would for a long time. Sometimes some of those techniques, sometimes they clicked right away. Sometimes they learned a little after. Sometimes they didn't get implemented for years, but they did. And that's what's important. And I've always thought to myself, I just hope that I could let Rob know one day that it wasn't all in vain. That it did come out the other side, and it's still going strong.
Awesome. Well, hey, let's keep in touch.
All right. And thank you so much for doing the interview with me, with Mel. It was really actually great. I was hoping to hear from you again soon. It was really great doing this interview today. And I hope you have a good one.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Bye-bye.
You have a good one, Rob. Bye.